What is up, Iwu crew? Think about being trapped in a cave. Really trapped. You have slid headfirst into a tunnel between two larger caves. Dark walls surround you so close that you cannot even move your arms. They're trapped at your sides. You've gotten yourself stuck. You are completely unable to free yourself, no matter what you do. There is no way out. You're counting on other people to come rescue you. And good news, they know exactly where you are. You can even communicate with them. Even better, they've actually managed to grab hold of you and have started to pull you to freedom. But just as you start to believe that you might actually breathe fresh air again, they lose their grip on you and you slide back down into the pit, still unable to use your arms. It is quickly dawning on both you and your rescue party that there is nothing they can do to save you. It's too dangerous to try to grab you again, and even if they did want to risk it, it takes so long to get to you that you are likely to already be dead by the time they reach you again. Think about dying alone, totally trapped, able to hear your friends and family and even respond to them. But you know you'll never see them again. You know they're going to leave you to die, trapped down there in the dark. And they do. You die, all alone, terrified, claustrophobic, blood pooling in your head. This is exactly what happened to John Jones in Nutty Putty Cave. The cave. Named for the sticky, moldable clay that lines most of the walls of this network of caves, Nutty Putty Cave is located just west of Utah Lake in northern Utah. Unlike the expansive underground structures you might be imagining, this cave is actually a web of very tight tunnels, opening up into slightly larger rooms. Most of the time spent in the cave is spent crawling through narrow passages, making it an oddity that has attracted spelunkers from all over the world. The chutes are large enough for the average person to navigate, but small enough to make it a unique experience. Since its discovery in 1960, thousands have made their way through the cave on their hands and knees. John Jones. John grew up in the area. His parents described him as good-natured, funny, hard-working, and curious. He and his family had made hundreds of outings to surrounding caves as he was growing up. They were not only familiar with the caves in the area, but with the appropriate safety measures to take when exploring a cave. When John grew up, he moved away from Utah, settling in Virginia with his wife Emily and their year-old daughter. He was studying to become a doctor who took a break from classes to travel back to Utah for the Thanksgiving holiday, his small family in tow. His brother Josh, glad to have his brother back in town for a few days, planned a caving expedition. 9 of their friends and family members decided to tag along, not including John's wife Emily, who was newly pregnant with their second child. At 26, John had not been inside of a cave in years. He was no longer the scrawny teenage Boy Scout who could easily shimmy his way through any crack and crevice. He was just over 6 feet tall and now weighed about 200 pounds. But he had loved caving as a boy and was eager to get back out into the Utah wilderness to do some exploring. Even at this time of year, as snow was blanketing nearby Salt Lake City, the interior of the cave would be temperate, heated by the geothermically warmed water that had originally made the cave millennia ago. It would be a fun outing. The party arrived at the mouth of the cave at 8 p.m. The next day, no one would be able to explain why they had arrived at the cave so late. Their first stop was the big slide, wide enough for explorers to sit down and slide forward. This one was one of the most expansive areas of the cave. John, his brother Josh, and 2 of their friends were not impressed. They wanted a challenge. They'd heard about Nutty Putty Cave all their lives and were eager to find one of the tighter crevices to squeeze through. There were dozens of smaller passages that required twisting and a precise pattern of movements to navigate, and they weren't going to leave the cave without trying one. An hour after entering the cave, the 4 men broke off from their group in search of a formation called the birth canal. If you enter the birth canal head first, you slide out onto a smaller circular room that gives way to even more claustrophobic passages. When John would later be located by rescue teams, they would see that the group had overshot the birth canal and were properly lost. In the moment, however, he believed he found the right tunnel and headed inside, leading with his head and inching along by moving his hips. It would only be a few short minutes before he would realize he'd made a huge mistake. When he realized that this was not, in fact, the tunnel he had been looking for, there was no way for him to turn around or to slide backwards. The only option was to keep going forward. Ahead, however, the passage only became tighter. He exhaled, pushing the air from his lungs to help flatten his chest and inch forward again. That was his final mistake. When he took his next breath, his lungs expanded and he was stuck. Unable to move forward and certainly unable to move backwards. As he struggled to free himself, the headlamp he'd been wearing slid off his head and disappeared down the tunnel in front of him. He was trapped. He was alone. And the dark was closing in. Josh found his brother quickly. He could reach his brother's legs and desperately tried to pull him back out of the tunnel, but was not strong enough to free him from the vice-like grip of the cave's walls. The pulling loosened him a little, but when Josh lost his grip on John's legs, he only slid further into the tunnel, pinning his arms under his chest. The fact that John was in serious danger dawned on the brothers quickly. They shared a quick, desperate prayer, and then Josh made for the cave entrance to call for help. Because of the location of the cave itself and how deeply in the cave John was stuck, it took more than an hour for search and rescue to make their way to John's position with the equipment they hoped they could use to extricate him from the tunnel. It seemed like an easy enough task. Just grab his legs and pull him backwards. If he could slide in, then he could slide out. By the time that the first rescuer reached John, he had been in the tunnel for over 3 hours. She told John her name was Susie Matola. She was covered in dirt, mud, and sweat from the long, winding trek down to where John lay, almost upside down. John responded, "Hi, Susie. Thanks for coming, but I really want to get out." Susie was significantly smaller than John, and she knew every inch of Nutty Putty Cave. That's why she had volunteered to go in first. At 5'3", she could at least get her arms out in front of her after inching her way out the tunnel. She told John, "Oh, no worries. You're going to be out of here lickety-split." That wasn't the case. Susie started by tying a rope around John's legs and running it back to the team waiting higher up in the cave. The 3 rescuers weren't strong enough to dislodge him from the crevice. She tried to have him twist into a different position, but they still couldn't leverage him out of the tunnel. She tried cutting away his clothing, hoping they would be able to peel it back and give him an extra inch of room. None of these efforts netted any improvement in John's situation. Susie tried to keep John talking. Talking would keep both of them calm, but the human body isn't designed to be tipped forward like John was for any length of time. When standing upright, the heart can use gravity to do a lot of the work of circulating blood. Flipped upside down, like John was, his heart was having difficulty pumping the blood pooling in his chest and head. Susie could hear the sound of fluid starting to collect in his lungs as John talked. After 2 hours, sometime between 2 and 3 a.m. on November 25th, Susie had exhausted her options. She told John to hold on and crawled back up to the surface. Another member of the search and rescue team joined John in the tunnel. Up above, the team had been putting together a pulley system. Each piece had to be carefully lowered into the cave. The team had to find somewhere to anchor the pulleys in the brittle stone of the cave walls. But they were optimistic. As the night dragged on, more and more people responded to the call. They began offering alternative ideas. Could they reach the tunnel from the other side? Could they cover him in oil and slide him out? Could they bring an industrial drill? These ideas were all too dangerous or were made impossible by the size and shape of the cave. The main team of rescuers continued to work on the pulley system. It was the same idea that had pulled a teenager in a similar predicament to safety only a few years earlier. That teenager had been 60 pounds lighter and considerably shorter. But as they hooked John up and started to winch in the line, it looked like it was going to work. Until John's feet hit the ceiling of the tunnel. He had been tipped forward for so long that even the slightest pressure on his legs caused him so much pain that he screamed. Horror dawned on the rescuers as they discovered that the tunnel was angled in such a way that John could not be pulled straight upwards out of it. They would have to bend his legs backwards over his body, breaking them. He was already in so much pain, and his body was already struggling to stay awake and alive. The pain could send him into shock, and the shock could kill him even faster. This was the 12-hour mark. The powdery walls of the cave were doing a poor job of holding the pulley system's cams, so the rescue team began to try to drill deeper holes to anchor them more securely. They were just going to have to break John's legs and try to pull him to safety quickly enough to treat the shock. John was waning. When Susie had first slid down into the tunnel behind him, he was coherent, answering her questions, talking to her about religion, music, and her family. Now, he was accusing the rescuers of having put him in the tunnel. He'd been calm before. To his credit, it had taken 12 hours for panic to truly set in. It was all-consuming now. He kicked and thrashed, calming down only when the rescuers prompted him to talk about his wife, Emily, and their 1-year-old. On the morning of November 25th, Emily was allowed to come to the scene and talk to John through a radio. They were both panicked, crying, but John promised her he was going to get out. It was late afternoon by the time the new pulley system was in place. After 19 hours upside down, the team was ready to pull him to safety, slowly allowing him to rest every few minutes as they yanked him upwards. Both John and the rescuers knew they were going to get him out. At the mouth of the cave, the line suddenly went slack, and the 8 people pulling it sprawled backwards. Later, they would learn that the stone arc above the tunnel, through which they had threaded the rope attached to the pulleys, was broken. It rained rock down on John. A carabiner plummeted into the face of the rescuer at John's side, knocking him out and breaking his jaw. When the wounded rescuer was hauled out and another slid in, John asked if he was going to die. The team assured him that they were going to get him out. The last thing John would ever do was to ask about the rescuer who had been in the tunnel with him when the pulley system failed. He asked, "Is he okay?" And then, nothing. The team continued to try to pull him out.
Rescuers say Jones is exhausted. They were able to pull him to a more comfortable position for a short period of time and even provided him with food and water. But then equipment failed.
They tried to drill new holes to support the pulleys, but they were exhausted. They had to swap positions frequently, and only one person could ascend or descend the cave at one time. Emily believed her husband would survive. He was unconscious, the team told her, but he was alive. She told him, "I know you've been pushing so hard for so long. Why don't you rest for a minute and take a break? And then you can push again." He couldn't hear her. Over 25 hours after John crawled into the tunnel and got stuck, a paramedic braved the frightening press of Nutty Putty Cave and pronounced him dead. Emily was not so sure. They had been trying to take his pulse in his legs, but his heart hadn't been able to pump blood into his legs for hours. How could they really know whether or not he was breathing? He might still just be unconscious. How could she leave him there, not knowing whether or not he was really dead? Finally, she agreed to leave Nutty Putty Cave when Utah County Sheriff's Lieutenant Tom Hodgson, the commander on the scene, promised her that they would get her husband's body out of the cave. Even that, however, turned out to be a hollow promise after hours of trying, even after they were sure that John Jones was dead. The entire team realized that as impossible as it had been to get John out when he was alive, it would be even more impossible now that he was dead. He was no longer able to push. The tunnel was a tight corkscrew, and with his body limp and lifeless, he couldn't twist to help them maneuver his body out of the space. Hodgson decided that it was too dangerous to continue to try to get him out. Instead, they would seal the entrance of the cave with John's body inside. His death had been torturous. It had been physically painful, yes, but the trauma of believing he was going to get out and then having that dashed twice would have been much more terrifying. The deep-seated fears of loneliness and of the dark reared their heads as John died. Out there in the Utah desert Nutty Putty Cave is John Jones' tomb, leaving only a bleached skeleton behind, all alone, still wedged in that twisted tunnel.